mind starting with just a small introduction to you and your writing and this book?
Okay, my name's Alan Parks, and I've been writing books about a Glasgow detective called Harry McCoy in the 1970s for a while. But the latest one to come out is a bit different. It's set in Glasgow in 1941. It's about a guy called Joseph Gunner who gets injured in the war and comes back. He's a policeman, comes back home and is asked to help try and solve an investigation.
There are five Harry McCoy books. What made you think it was time for a new protagonist? And are you done with Harry McCoy? Was that
No,
question?
no, I've written the sixth one. That's done. So
Okay.
I think I kept seeing little bits about Glasgow during the war for a few years, and I started to sort of read about it a little bit. And like the 70s, it's a time when Glasgow was in real, well, like the rest of half the world was in real flux, and things were changing quickly and stuff. So I think when cities are like that, you're able to do sort of interesting stories about them. I just sort of was making notes and stuff, and it sort of gradually turned itself into a book. So that was that.
And obviously they're both set in Glasgow at
Yes.
these different times. What does the city mean to you personally? And why do you think it works as a setting for crime fiction in particular?
When I was wee, we lived in a place called Elderslie, which was a village. It's a bit bigger now, but it was a village where absolutely nothing happened. I mean, it was just, nothing. And all my cousins, my aunties and uncles and grandparents all lived in big housing schemes in the north of Glasgow. And when I used to go and visit, I thought it was just the best place ever. It was, hundreds of kids running about, and dogs and ice cream vans, and so I always treated Glasgow as quite glamorous and exciting, And I haven't really changed that much. I always like being in Glasgow, and especially doing these Harry McCoy books. If you wander about different parts of Glasgow, which is basically what I do, you still find new things you don't know anything about. So I think Glasgow's still a place that really interests me, and always was quite um, crime orientated city, shall we say. In the 70s, half the city was knocked down, and it was, there was a lot of money to be made, either legally or not legally. And, it was a kind of wild place to be. And the same in the 40s, same, a lot of people did very well out the war, in the black market. And the city at both those times just seemed an interesting place to write about and to set some stories, I think.
I mean, some of the characters in Gunner are just so interesting. Like what you were saying just then was
Yeah.
making me think of Drummond.
Like Gunner, the big middle bit of the police all went to the war. And in Glasgow, you were left with the old guys who they got back
Mm.
from retirement, and like 17, 18-year-old kids who were in a thing called police auxiliary, which really was traffic and, that sort of stuff. Crime kind of blossomed a lot during the war because there just weren't very many policemen. Drummond's quite pleased to be brought back because he's finding retirement a bit useless. The reason he gets gunners, he just hasn't got anyone, apart from anyone else, he hasn't got anyone else who can help try and work this out. Police were that time, in the 70s as well, they were a lot less user friendly than they are now, I suppose. They were a bit more rough and ready and a bit more physical and all that sort of stuff. And that's been Drummond's, world. And he's happy to get back into it, I think.
Mm. Yeah, he's horrible. It creates this tension between Gunner and Drummond and gives Gunner, as the main guy, this sort of reluctance and this like grit, which I
Yeah.
really enjoyed.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't really want to help him, he's had enough of everything. And ostensibly he's back while they decide whether he's able to go back into the army or not. And the last thing he wanted to do was get drawn back into, a police investigation. But I think partly out of his kind of duty as a police officer and partly because of Drummond, he gets dragged back in. And, it wasn't his intention at all.
When it comes to Gunner,
Hmm.
you obviously have a skill for building these sort of very rich protagonists that will carry through a whole
Yeah.
series. And I did sort of feel so on Gunner's side all the way through. How do you build a main character like that? Where do you start?
I never write policemen. I always just write someone who's a policeman, and weirdly, that kind of it's their job isn't their total definition of themselves. He's got problems with his health, he's got problems with addiction. He's a real person who happens to be working as a policeman. And I think if you look at it that way, rather than start as being a policeman. You can kind of make people seem a bit more believable. And um, I don't think, I'm not very good at police procedural type stuff. I don't really know any of it. And to be brutally honest, I don't really care. So, if it's not full of what he actually does, it's more full of what he's thinking and what he's feeling, what he's going through while he's doing the sort of investigations.
That's so interesting and also really reassuring.
I'll tell you that I'm sure there's another author called Liam McIlvanney who writes detective books. And coincidentally, his books are set in the 70s, and his detective in this world lives around the corner from McCoy. Would do if it was reality. So I was having dinner with him one night, and he said to me, Alan, how many policemen did you talk to before you started, writing? And I was too embarrassed to go none. So I said, oh, two. I thought that sounded quite good. And I said, how about you? He said, I think it was 9 or 10. And I was like, God. But if you read his books, you can tell who has and who hasn't done the research. He's really good in all that police structure stuff and how it technically works and chains of command and all that stuff. And his mind's just really sort of people grunting at each other in pubs. It's a bit different. So, but he likes that kind of stuff. I don't really, he writes really good books that have got that in it, but it's just not my lane, if you know what I mean. I just don't have that much interest in trying to do that stuff. I think the people are more interesting in what's happening than the mechanics of police procedurals.
Well, it's fiction, isn't it?
Well, it's a story. It's
Yeah.
not agreed to Glasgow Police in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Fundamentally it's a story. So I think as long as it's got some semblance of reality, you're kind of fine.
And when it comes to the history, how real does that have to
It
be?
has to be the main things have to be real. The bombing of Glasgow has to be real. What happened has to be real. As long as you don't go nutty, you can sort of move around a little bit, but you got to make sure that the pivotal events are are told pretty straight. You can't suddenly go, I've decided that now they're going to bomb the centre of Glasgow, which didn't happen. It's then you're just getting away from something into something else. So the big events you have to keep track of. It's what I always call hard research and soft research. The hard research is what date was Glasgow bombed. The soft research is, you think about what were people watching at the cinema, what were they listening to on the radio, what were they wearing, all that sort of stuff. And hopefully the two of them kind of combine and give you a picture of the time.
Do you start with the research and then build the story? What comes first?
A lot of it's to do with places, actually. I sometimes find places in Glasgow I want to write about. This book, I kind of was interested because Glasgow at the time was a big transport hub. A lot of troops and sailors and everything went through Glasgow to get ships to everywhere and all this stuff. And it had a reputation as a place where you could disappear. That, a lot of people went and did basic training, came back and never went back. They just went underground. So Glasgow had a reputation being a big city. It was very busy. There wasn't a huge police force, and they'd obviously better things to do than try and find. So a lot of people sort of officially disappeared in Glasgow, so that was quite interesting. And the idea that, contrary to the sort of Blitz spirit idea, that there was a huge amount of crime going on in the city at the time was also kind of interesting. And, I thought those two things made it a more sort of exciting prospect to write about. Once you get that in your head, then you think, well, where would these people that disappeared go? Who would want to disappear? Why would they disappear? So the little historical things help, that you find out in your research help kick the story along, and change what you do sometimes, and I didn't realize, but I live about 10 minutes walk from a Hampden football station, which is where a huge amount of German POWs came through to be processed. And around Glasgow, there was like a ring of prisoner of war camps for German and also weirdly, mainly Italian, because Glasgow had a big Italian population. And if you weren't born here, if you were born in Italy, you put in the camp because you were a foreign unfriendly national. So a lot of Glasgow people who the day before were running, a restaurant or ice cream cafe were suddenly stuck in these, internment camps. So there was a lot going on.
It does feel like every character is really rooted and has their own history and their own sort of, you really understand how they've all got to this point.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
hopefully.
who did you enjoy writing the most?
Drummond's quite easy to write because he's just a bit of a swine, and that's always quite good fun to write. And he's quite, he keeps shouting at him. everyone and all that stuff, which is quite good fun. Gangsters are always good fun, always a bit more fun to write than the cops because they're a bit more all over the place, So I think, well, if I think they're interesting, hopefully other people will, and I think that's the way you can do it. And to do that, they have to have a bit of, as I said, a bit of a life that isn't just a policeman. They have to have relatives, they have to have a story, and a personality. So hopefully that comes through a bit.
There's one bit at the end, Nixon, I don't want to give any spoilers. There's one bit at the end where somebody says, as with most wars, the young are expendable, so the old can stay in power. And
Yeah.
ever it was so. And I really felt that. I felt the difference between the young characters and the old characters.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I think weirdly people are starting to think about it now. Everyone's suddenly going because it's been so long since anyone in Britain or the West has thought that there might be conscription or there might be an actual war. That suddenly it's your kids. It's a different thing, and people think about it a different way. It's always the young people that end up dying in wars. It's not people my age. So
Did you feel like you were trying to consciously bring that perspective into the
I
book?
don't know. I mean, the Glasgow people are sort of famously cynical about everything. So I think that's probably quite a common view in Glasgow at the time. As I said, there's a kind of whitewashed blitz spirit idea of life in Britain during the war, which has some truths, but it's not entirely true, and it was that side that I think was a bit more interesting to have a think about.
With the imagery of like violence and war and bodies,
Yeah.
how do you how do you know how far to go with that? Because it's really
um,
disturbing it sometimes, but I think it's really important to like
yeah, I
to sort
think
of keep it real.
I try and not say much about it, but what you say is quite impactful, So if you could describe it in 2 or 3 sentences that are quite vivid rather than 2 pages of unrelenting, and then his nose was broken, and then his lip was broken. I think it's just a question of scale, really. I suppose if you're writing a book about some Silence of the Lambs serial killer, you're going to be more along that alley. But I don't know. It's you just kind of have to feel that's what's enough and what's not.
Can I read another of my favorite bits?
All right.
Gunnar looked out from between his hands just in time to see a dog flying through the air and hit a bread van on the other side of the street. A chest of drawers landed by him and burst on impact. There were dead birds everywhere, some still on fire, some just smoking. He buried his head in his hands when he saw a leg land by the grocer's across the street. He didn't want to see any more. See, I think that's such a good sort of, it's almost surreal, but it's like, it's got the horrific imagery,
Yeah.
but it's also in this sort of realistic, everyday objects are intertwined.
Yeah, I think what's quite good is when ordinary objects become strange, and
Mm.
suddenly a sofa explodes, or some, and you think, or a dog, it's not the stuff you think about initially, or birds in the sky, you think about buildings, collapsing and all this stuff, but I think again, it's a bit like the violence. It's the little bits that I think are more evocative. I'd rather write about the little odd things than the whole, and hopefully they can be more evocative than pages of buildings falling down and people being squashed or whatever. So because I think if you read that bit, you understand how powerful the bomb is without having to go through it all in grisly detail.
How much planning do you do when you're approaching a book?
I do some visual stuff. I collect little visual references for things, and there's some places that I want to write about. And I knew, I found out that the Kelvin Hall, which to everyone in Glasgow is kind of like, it was where the fair used to be, and there was a zoo, and it was where big concerts, and it was a kind of fun place, a big. And when I found out that that was used as a temporary morgue, even if it doesn't really go travel far, people in Glasgow, but geez, because that is a huge place, and you sort of start to realise the scale. So I wanted to get that in. And I read something about some bomb hit a warehouse that was full of jam, and the whole street was covered in sticky, hot jam. And there's just weird little things that I kind of wanted to do. Once you got those things, you just kind of have to find a way to join them together that makes the story move along, and it makes a bit of sense. So it's really once you get 4 or 5 places or incidents in your brain, then you can start to work out what the story is and how it hits them. I think planning, it's just an excuse not to do it sometimes. People, they go, oh, I must write an outline. I'm like, I know people who write literally, and it's almost as long as a finished book. And I'm like, well, why did you bother? Why don't you just write it? You know, I couldn't write it again after I'd done it once. You'd be bored to death of it. I think, plus, you find out things in the course of writing it that change where you're going. Because in one of the books, in the McCoy books, there's someone dies, or someone gets murdered, and I went to look at where they were just in case there was something there that I thought should go in the book or something. And across the road there was a pub, huge big pub, and I thought, well, the guy that lives here, that's probably his local. So you do a bit of research into the pub, and you find out that during the 70s, it was one of only two pubs in Glasgow that would really let travelling people in for a drink because they were really incredibly discriminated against. So that suddenly became part of the story, that I didn't think of before. So sometimes research or going to the place can really change the course of the book, which is quite good.
So was there anything with Gunner that surprised you during the process of writing? Did the plot ever take a turn that you didn't expect?
Yeah, it did. Originally, the sailors, the brothers, were a really minor role, but then I knew I needed him at the end. So I had to sort of big up their role a bit, and because the younger brother is a bit flash and a bit gangstery, I wanted the other brother to be completely different. So they suddenly became bigger components than I thought they would. As did Fraser, the sort of young police auxiliary guy. He grew a little bit. He was really just there originally to tell you what the police auxiliary was, so you would understand. But he grew up. He grew a bit. So yeah, bits come and go, and sometimes characters you think are going to be interesting don't, and they get diminished, and other ones come up, So it's nice when you start writing someone who didn't really have much to do with anything, and you find a way, to make them interesting, develop them a bit. So it does change a lot. It's pretty fluid, really, till the end where you think, Jesus, I've got to make all this tie up. And then you're like, oh my God. Um, but I think that's more, I kind of write the characters into terrible situations. I don't know how they're going to get out, and then I have to work it out, So it's quite
Mm.
good to give yourself that, well, you're going to have to find some way to get this to move from there, So it's quite good fun doing that.
I think you can tell when you're reading a book and it's been planned too much as well.
Yeah, it just gets a little lifeless somehow, and nothing odd
Yeah.
happens.
What stage were you at when you decided to have Rudolf Hess as a plot point?
I'm always slightly wary about these, sort of the real story behind Rudolf Hess, and it's like Rudolf Hess was really there just to provide a bit of a background to what they were investigating. It was just too good an opportunity to miss. He sort of he ticked a lot of boxes. And everyone in Glasgow, not everyone in Glasgow, but there's an awful lot of anecdotes about Hess in Glasgow. Oh, my grandfather's brother was in the taxi when they picked him up. Oh, my grandfather's
Really?
brother's cousin was the farmer that found. And I'm like, there must be about 50,000 people saw Hess that day, So there's still a lot of kind of mythology about it, and people think about it. And it was, he crashed about 3 miles up that way. It's not far.
Yeah, I was about to ask if it
Yeah.
was as close as it
Yeah,
as it was
it's
in the book.
literally it's now basically the suburbs, So at the time it was more farmlandy, but it was really near, So it was just it just worked in too well, I think.
The
But
concept of the finding sort of body doubles for him.
again, that's what some people think. A bit of a magnet for conspiracy theories because he was quite a strange person, and what happened to him was genuinely quite elusive. No one quite knew. So he tends to attract a lot of, you know, he was replaced and all this kind of stuff. And, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know what happened, to be honest. I don't think most people do. But certain facts, but he did go to the gatehouse in Maryhill Barracks. And shortly after that, he was taken down to London, and he did crash, 3 miles that way. So, it's there's certain truth in what his motives were and what he was really up to is a bit more up for grabs.
Why did you decide to write in this genre in the first place?
Oh, that's a good question. As kind of said before, the idea that policemen, because I wanted to write about Glasgow, and there's a lot of different ways you can do that, but I didn't want to write about one little strata. I wanted to write about the whole city, and very few jobs take people through that whole thing. You could be a journalist, maybe policeman, fireman. This sort of, there's not that many where you encounter and you sort of question people from different backgrounds. And that was really why I thought a policeman would be good, because that's what they do. You can get them to operate anywhere. And I think I like the idea that it's a detective novel. It gives you a kind of scaffold, the structure of it, because you have to have something happens and somebody dies. At the end, you're supposed to find out why, and all this stuff, which I quite like, because then within that scaffold, you can add on the bits that you're maybe more interested in. Like gold.
Ian Fleming famously, one of his like famous quotes is about the only thing you need to do to write a thriller is to get the reader to keep turning the page.
I kind of agree,
So,
to be honest.
as a reader, what makes you turn the page? And as a writer, how do you make the reader turn the page?
I think it's the same thing. It's you just want to find out what happened to the people, and it's really the people. It's unless the people you're in the book are interesting, you can have the best and most complicated plot and nobody's going to read it. You have to feel some sort of empathy and some interest in those people. So that's what I look for when I read a book. The big movie script thing is, put your hero in the worst trouble, then make it worse. Pile it on. If you're going to write a book about the war, you have to have big things happening and piling
Yeah.
on time, and it's easier to write about someone in trouble or in peril than it is about, someone who's having a nice time. So you kind of,
About three-quarters of the way through, I was like, oh my God, he hasn't slept for so long. I
I know
just
I'm
want him to
scared
have
at
a
these things. I
nap.
know I keep, people do 2 weeks, they haven't been to bed. And then
Am I right in thinking there are future Gunner books to look forward to?
the second Gunner one's done.
Yeah. Oh, it's done.
Somewhat bizarrely, Ian Fleming is in it, because it's
Ian
set,
Fleming's in it.
set in New York just before Pearl Harbor. So yeah, that was good. And then the third one, which I'm writing just now, is set in Nice and Marseille in 1942.
Well, that's very exciting. Lots more Gunner to look forward to. Oh, thanks for talking to me.
You're very
Enjoy,
welcome.
enjoy the all right
I
weather.
know. Enjoy the enjoy the not too bad weather.
Thank you.
You too. See you later. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for watching this James Bond Book Club interview, and we'll see you next time.